So I've been using the Pixel Fold for a while, and I now get why you'd want to switch from the traditional slab style phone to one that folds. Originally, I wasn't sure if I'd even like this form factor or if I'd know what to do with that bigger screen on the inside, but it grew on me pretty quickly. Like, I don't open up the phone every time I use it, but when I do, I feel like there's a purpose and I feel really productive. Starting on the outside, there's a 5.8-inch display that goes up to about 1500 nits peak brightness with up to 120 hertz refresh rate. It's a solid display that you can see outside and it feels really responsive. And I think the most important part, which really got me to like this phone, I think, is the aspect ratio, which is 17.4 by 9. So rather than the taller aspect ratio of like the Z Fold, this is kind of more like a passport shape. So when it's closed, the Pixel Fold just looks like any other small phone. It's just a bit shorter than the iPhone and honestly about the same width with the case on. Apps look how you'd expect them, and I find it perfectly usable one-handed. Like, it doesn't feel too small being shorter than like a traditional phone, but everything is just so much more reachable. I probably spend like 80% of my time using the Pixel Fold folded, but I think that's the point. Let me know down in the comments, but I feel like I don't want to have to open this phone every single time I pull it out of my pocket, which is, I think, one of the reasons that I'm not a fan of the flip style phones. I really like that the outside screen just lets me do most things, but when I need it, I have the option of opening up to that larger 7.6-inch screen. And speaking of which, the inside screen has a 6:5 aspect ratio, an always on display, and up to 120 hertz refresh rate. It is a little dimmer with a peak brightness around 1400 nits, but it's still perfectly fine outside, and honestly, I find it pretty comparable to the outside screen. There's also support for split screen apps so you can multitask, which I really like for having things like Map and Chrome, Gmail and Calendar, or like a YouTube video and Slack. There were a couple of points when I thought that having 4 apps would be more efficient, I guess, with like 2 on each side. But with the way that I work and just how I focus on things, having 1 app per half of the display just was a lot more useful. Alternatively, you can also have just a single app in full screen, which I find to be kind of hit or miss depending on the app. Some apps, mainly the Google ones, are optimized to take advantage of the whole display, but others kind of just float around in the middle. There's this really cool double tap feature, so you can just tap on the black bar on either side of the app and move it over so you could use it one-handed. But at that point, you might as well just use the outside display or open a second app to fill up that pretty much blank half of your phone. I did find though that like for apps that aren't fully optimized, you can just rotate the phone 90 degrees and it'll relaunch them to fit the whole screen. I think this is probably because the phone opens up into landscape, so when you switch it to portrait and relaunch the app, it just fixes any scaling issues. And as much as I really like the inside screen, like technically and like functionally, I do have 2 issues with it. First, it doesn't open fully flat, and I'll get to the hinge itself, but it's like just shy of 180 degrees. Actually, it's kind of a lot like a book where it stays open at the spine, kind of, and it doesn't fully go flat. I couldn't really use this phone while it's open and sitting on a table. It just rocks back and forth, and I felt like I was gonna break it. So you really just have to hold it or use it in like a laptop-esque mode, which I will say though is great for watching videos, and the phone is propping itself up so I can see the screen while I'm doing other things. I'm sure this will get fixed in the next iteration and another version of the hinge, but it is kind of annoying to have a phone that can't lie flat on a table. And second, the bezels are like massive. The outer display is perfectly fine, but on the inside, they're big and asymmetrical. Like, I get needing a bit of bezel so you have somewhere to hold the phone, but less probably still would work for that. Also, there's a hole punch camera on the outside. I kind of wonder why they didn't just do that on the inside too, if that's possibly a reason they added the thicker bezel. I will say I'm probably just really used to the edge-to-edge screens on like the iPhone and other slab phones, which did take a few years to get to. I haven't had a chance to try any of the other folding phones, but I feel like it's probably a similar progression, right? Like, you start with bigger bezels, you can eventually shrink them down. And I guess it's similar to the hinge not opening all the way flat, right? So I'm excited to see what the Pixel Fold 2 is like. Like, hopefully they refine it down to make it even better. But going back to the actual hinge, it's really good for a first version. Like, it's smooth and sturdy, and it feels well built. There's enough friction to keep it open at pretty much any angle, so you're not limited to either fully closed or fully open. Also, I will say I did drop this once and I was concerned about whether or not I'd affect the movement, but it still feels fine. I just ended up with a couple scratches on the side. In general though, I haven't been like super careful with this, maybe a little bit more so than like my iPhone, but I'm sure some dust has gotten in the hinge and it feels fine. Like, it doesn't feel like there's any issues. I am glad though that the hinge can fold perfectly flat when it's closed. Like, you put a sheet of paper in here and like it holds onto it. But on the other hand, if something gets in between these screens before you close it, with how low tolerances there are, I'm sure you're gonna break something. Also, the bezels just collect a lot of dust at the edges, so it kind of stresses me out sometimes that I'm gonna have something just build up, and then as I close the screen, it will be bad. Another thing I was really excited to try out was the cameras. Having a folding form factor just unlocks a couple of interesting features. Starting with the actual cameras, there's a 9.5 megapixel camera on the front and an 8 megapixel camera on the inside, which are both great for video calls. But since this is a foldable, you could also just use the rear camera. There's a 48 megapixel main sensor that bends down to 12 megapixels, a 10.8 megapixel ultra wide camera, and an 18 megapixel telephoto camera with a 5x optical zoom. I really like the photos that I get out of this. The exposure is pretty even in like most scenarios, and there's a good dynamic range. There are times when it looks like there's a bit too much HDR, but overall, I think they look great. Most of my day-to-day photos are on the wide and occasionally the ultra wide. I did a couple tests with the telephoto, but I didn't find myself using it much outside of that. Like I mentioned earlier, the telephoto is a 5x optical zoom, which is about the equivalent of a 112 millimeter focal length, but Google has a super res zoom to give you a bit more reach using software. It uses machine learning to bring down the noise levels and give you up to a 30x zoom. It definitely looks a lot better than just digital zooming, but you can tell there is still some post-processing being done. Speaking of which though, I don't take many selfies, but I do feel like there's too much smoothing and other processing going on for the inner and outer cameras. But on the flip side, you can just unfold the phone and use the main camera for a full 48 megapixel photo with a viewfinder on the bottom half, and I think it just looks better. Also, I will say it's really cool how the camera app adapts to how the phone is folded and unfolded. So if it's folded halfway, you get a viewfinder on the top with exposure and the rest of your controls on the bottom. But when you unfold the phone, it switches to being a full screen preview like you'd expect. But you can also just switch the preview to the outside screen, so you have the camera and preview on the same side. Also, like the Pixel 7, I don't use this much for video. I mean, it looks good with a lot of light, but it does start to get kind of noisy pretty fast. I still usually stick with the iPhone for video. I do like that they offer some like different stabilization options for video. It's cool that you can use like software to get some cooler shots you'd otherwise need some external hardware for, like cinematic pan or the lock stabilization. The battery life has been pretty good. Like by the time I go to bed, it's usually at about 10-ish to 20%. And I will say it's pushing it a little bit if it's like, you know, a particularly long day, but it is powered by Tensor G2 with 12 gigs of RAM, and it hardly stutters. There are some times when it gets a bit warm, but I didn't notice that to actually affect performance. It is mostly when I'm using the phone out in the sun or immediately after wireless charging. Overall, I really like the Pixel Fold and just like form factor as a whole, right? Like this is a really good first gen product, and there's so much room for improvement with version 2. Like they already have a solid hinge, bright screens, and really good cameras. There's so much potential on the software side to really take advantage of the screens in creative ways and maybe even give people more reasons to open up the phone. As it is though, this is like my favorite Pixel so far when it's closed, and it's like a bonus that it can open up into a bigger screen. I can't wait to see how they build on this in both hardware and software, and you know, maybe even give other foldables a shot, possibly even a flip. But thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos about tech, cameras, and making. Here's a video about an AR monocle, and here's a video that YouTube thinks you're gonna like the best.